US President Donald Trump is intensifying his efforts to end the war in Ukraine and is expected to meet Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Western sanctions against Russia and military support for Ukraine have failed to bring peace. But could an end to the war be nearing? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finighan. US President Donald Trump pledged to end the war in Ukraine in a day after taking office. He's not managed that, but he's been turning up the heat on the Kremlin. This week, he made good on his threat to target countries trading with Moscow, slapping an extra 25% tariff on India for buying Russian oil. Hardly a coincidence that it came on the day his special envoy Steve Witkoff met President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Both sides described the discussions as positive, with the Kremlin saying that a meeting between Trump and Putin could happen as soon as next week. Trump called Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky afterwards on a conference call with leaders of the UK, Germany, Finland and NATO. All this before his deadline for Russia to make significant progress on a peace deal with Ukraine. So, are we entering a new phase, one that could see an end to the fighting soon? And if not, what next? We'll speak to our guests shortly, but first, this report from Felix Naiwara.
Donald Trump once promised he'd end the war between Ukraine and Russia within 24 hours of returning to the White House. Nearly 7 months later, the fighting still rages. This year has seen some of the worst attacks on Russian and Ukrainian soil since the conflict began in early 2022. The UN says it recorded a 37% increase in civilian deaths and injuries in the first 5 months of this year, compared with the same period last year. Nearly 3.5 years of war have left people in both Russia and Ukraine longing for peace. Now, perhaps, a glimmer of hope. The Kremlin says President Vladimir Putin will meet the US president soon.
Everything that leads to negotiations, if smart people are meeting, usually ends with an agreement. To be honest, all of this is so hard for everybody, so I feel positive.
I feel positive about it. Talks are needed anyway. Without negotiations, there will be no result.
I do not trust Putin, so I think that this meeting will not be serious on his part. He will never make peace. He needs Ukraine. He wants to conquer it. So I think nothing good will come out of this meeting.
I think that the meeting itself will not change anything, but each step by step, and the events must be resolved. I am an optimist. I believe that something will work out.
US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff was in Moscow on Wednesday, his 5th trip this year to meet President Putin. The Kremlin described the talks as constructive, while the White House said great progress was made. While this may mark a turning point in the drawn-out conflict, major obstacles remain. Key among them, territory Russia has annexed in eastern Ukraine, which Kiev wants back, and Ukraine's bid for NATO membership, a red line for Moscow. Felix Naiwara, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
So let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Moscow is Ivan Timofeev, the director of the Russian International Affairs Council, a diplomatic think tank. In Rome is Michael Bociurkiw, a global affairs analyst and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And joining us from London, Chris Weafer, the CEO of the consultancy Macro-Advisory, which focuses on Russia and Eurasia. Gentlemen, welcome to you. Well, let's start with you, Ivan. What can we read into the fact that both Trump and Putin are keen to meet, even if the prospect of a trilateral meeting with Ukraine's president was initially brushed aside by the Kremlin? Putin went on to say later on Thursday he has no objection to meeting with President Zelensky. Is that new?
Well, I believe that the fact that that both presidents are going to meet is rather a positive sign. And today we see that the markets in Russia are very optimistic. They are growing up following this news. This means that the diplomacy is still demanded and that there is still a chance to move forward to peace in Ukrainian conflict.
Michael, President Trump claimed that great progress had been made in the talks between his envoy and President Putin on Wednesday. But was it? Has Donald Trump's latest attempt to strong-arm Moscow into peace talks with Ukraine actually failed, despite the spin that's being put on it?
Yeah, I think his attempts had failed. I call it a Trumpster fire, the threats of more tariffs and more sanctions. I think the Russians have taken their cue from India and basically ignored the tariff threats, and life goes on as usual. I think the Russians, Mr. Putin, very well realized, they figured out Mr. Trump that he's desperate, very desperate for a foreign affairs win. Nothing's gone his way, as your reporter, reminded us that he promised to settle this conflict in one day. Gaza is a mess right now, as you know, so he's desperate to get an achievement and bring it back home. And maybe this, in Trump's mind, will also propel his journey to a Nobel Peace Prize. But make no mistake, Mr. Putin will come to the table with maximalist demands. There may be some territorial concessions made there, but the Russians know, I think by now, how to play Mr. Trump their way.
Chris, do you agree with that? Does Moscow have anything to fear from Trump's Friday deadline of peace or sanctions? In what shape, for instance, is the Russian economy? Can Russia afford to shrug off Trump's threat?
No, they cannot. And I think that's one thing that has changed, certainly for the last, since January. Of course, we've been listening to President Trump make all sorts of threats and then back out of them, delay them, etc., and all over the place, global tariffs as well as regard to Russia. But that appears to be changing. And this week is very significant because we have seen President Trump now finally applying tariffs to countries, carrying out his threat to double the tariff on India because it's buying Russian oil. So there is a sense that President Trump, maybe because of frustration or he's running out of time or whatever, but he's getting more serious. So from what I hear in discussions with people I talk to in Moscow, is they're starting to take him more seriously than they did before. And yeah, you're right. The economy is important because while overall the economy is stable and there's some positive indicators, for example, inflation has peaked, interest rates are coming down, so it is quite stable. But the budget remains at risk. The budget deficit has gone up a lot more this year than had been intended. And clearly that cannot continue indefinitely. And if President Trump does anything to tighten Russia's oil export revenues, whether it's blocking volumes or targeting customers, then that will make the budget situation more dangerous and therefore could lead to an economic problem within months, certainly coming into next year. So I think the Russians are taking Trump more seriously now than they have done since January.
And Chris, as a brief aside, we talked about this in our last Inside Story about Trump's punitive sanctions on the buyers of Russian oil. China and India being the biggest, of course, and there's 50% tariffs now on India. How will India react? Is that going to stop India buying Russian oil?
Good. First of all, remember, there's a delay on the introduction of that sanction for about 3 weeks. So again, it's kind of focused on an intensification of negotiations with Russia. And the assumption is that if there is some sort of a deal or some sort of a process even agreed to start, like the peace process, within 3 weeks, then those tariffs against India will likely come off. So I think applying those tariffs against India was as much about putting pressure on Moscow to get serious about negotiations than it was against the Indian economy. The Indians themselves, of course, have been very defiant, say that they won't be bullied. They're quite likely, if we were to get to the point where those tariffs were applied, India would certainly be calling Moscow looking for a bigger discount on the oil that it's buying and would likely get it. But as I say, I think we have a 3-week window where by the end of August, and it's always been our belief that we would get to a point of a ceasefire coming into the autumn, simply because Moscow wants to do a deal with Trump. and they want to do it while he's still able to do a deal, and that may be compromised next spring as we look forward to midterms, and Trump's hands might become increasingly tied. So it is playing out, and I do expect a ceasefire in this autumn.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you, Chris, a little later about the timing of all of this and what significance that is. Ivan, so a meeting between Trump and Putin is set to happen possibly within days. Does President Putin particularly care about upsetting or angering President Trump? What can we read into the former, as in President Putin's, apparent confidence in the face of the latter's threats?
Well, President Putin is a very experienced politician, leader, especially in the realm of foreign affairs. I do not think that he's following the behavior of the European leaders who seem to avoid, let's say, the dissatisfaction of Mr. Trump on one issue or another. So he's quite self-confident, and one of the sources of his self-confidence is that sanctions and the threat of additional military supplies to Ukraine from the US are not perceived as critical factors. Yes, they may inflict more damage and they may complicate things on the field. Still, they are not much critical. So I do not think that President Putin believes that Donald Trump has significant cards in his hands to affect Russia.
Michael, what more could President Trump do, or perhaps offer President Putin, picking up on what you were saying before about Russia having worked out Donald Trump's modus operandi? What more could Donald Trump do to get President Putin to bring about a ceasefire? Could he perhaps offer other economic sweeteners alongside those threats to get President Putin to do what he wants him to do?
Yeah, well, I would advise him to go more on the punitive side of things. And one idea I've been evangelizing about, and possibly it's catching on, is to focus on the Gulf states. We well know that many countries in the Gulf region have long since laid out the red carpet to Russian tourists, Russian oligarchs. Russian oligarchs in Mr. Putin's circle are one of the biggest purchasers of luxury real estate. In the UAE, for instance, they park their yachts there. If Mr. Trump, who's not afraid to use threats against allies, we from Canada know that very well, if he used his leverage on those states, after all, the US does provide quite the security shield. It bases a lot of US troops there, and said, okay, enough is enough. You guys hold that trade with the Russians, that tourism, at least temporarily, until Russia really feels the pain. I think that would really, really get them where it hurts. And whether he will do that is another question, but I think he is running out of tools. And one more quick thing is I think the Russians need there has to be zero ambiguity. In other words, they have to be told that if we do come to an agreement with you for peace in Ukraine, if you bust those rules or if you ignore them, it's going to be unbearable pain for you. That's the only thing that they understand.
Chris, we've spent the first 10 minutes of the program talking about Russia. To what extent is Ukraine a sideshow here? To what extent is Russia the prize for President Trump?
I think that is a fair assessment from what we hear in Washington, and perhaps also what we're hearing maybe from Beijing and elsewhere. I mean, the big game, if you like, and I don't like to use the word game in this context, but nevertheless, you know, the big play is ultimately between the US and China. And we know that President Trump has many times, and people close to him have many times said that, you know, that their main objective of his presidency will be to confront China and to confront China's expansion. And there is a sense, therefore, that the Ukraine war needs to be resolved before the US can devote time and resources to that long-term goal of China containment. And therefore, Russia is important because, of course, Russia it's an enormous landmass, it's got enormous resources. If Russia were to be left in a position perhaps of losing the war or of being completely isolated by the West, then it would have no choice but to go even further all in with Beijing, and that would strengthen China's position. So there is a sense that Washington wants to end the war in Ukraine in such a way that it re-engages with Moscow, can still deal with Moscow in order to prevent Russia and China, if you like, becoming even more unified and therefore stronger for Beijing and more difficult for Washington to confront long term. So I think that's a fair assessment. The prize is bringing Russia back into some US or Western dialogue in order that it does not become solely dependent on Beijing.
Ivan, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that he didn't want to overstate the progress made during Steve Witkoff's meeting with President Putin, but that we have, quote, a better understanding of the conditions under which Russia would be willing to end the war, which the US would need to compare to what the Ukrainians are willing to accept. Russia perhaps needs an off-ramp before it can agree to a ceasefire. What would it take for President Putin to be able to declare the objectives of the war met?
Well, it's a big issue, of course, and lots will depend on the results of the negotiations. I believe that if the parameters, at least some parameters, some crucial parameters reflected in 2022 during the Istanbul meeting in March are satisfied in one way or another, then there will be a ground to declare the victory in this conflict, right? So this is non-alliance with NATO. These are the territorial concessions from the Ukrainian side. So this is the backbone of the objective. So if they are met, there will be a reason to declare a victory or the achievement of the goals.
Michael, do you agree with that? What would Russia settle for? What would Ukraine settle for?
Well, as for Ukraine, I think Mr. Zelensky is in a very difficult situation. As you know, he has lost ground politically at home by trying to dismantle those anti-corruption entities, those post-Maidan anti-corruption entities, and that prompted protests. There's now growing unrest, if we can put it that way, towards very harsh tactics used by military recruitment officers. So he has to be very, very careful in terms of going into any kind of summit and what he brings home. No doubt about it. I'm based in Ukraine. I talk to Ukrainians every day, and they're getting very, very tired. And there's a fear now that because of the relentless Russian bombing on places like Kherson and also Kharkiv, that more Ukrainians will be displaced, more will leave. So the main point here is that time is not on Mr. Zelensky's side. So he has to come to the table and act very forcefully in terms of what Ukraine expects territorially, but also no stepping away from NATO. There's the big issue of Russian payment of reparations, Crimea. The problem, again, is that I think with Mr. Trump gunning for that Nobel Peace Prize and a win to take home to his base, that he may fall for Mr. Putin's tactics or twisting manipulation. So the stakes could not be higher right now.
Chris, to what extent is perhaps a frozen conflict the best that we can hope for at the moment? A truce rather than peace, with negotiations over the final territorial settlement dragging long into the future?
I think that's the more likely outcome at this point, because as Michael said, and even before that, both leaders, Zelensky and Putin, they cannot afford to give too much away. And it applies to President Putin as well. Remember, he's brought the country into this war. It's been enormously expensive in terms of human costs on the Russian side as well, and of course on the economy. So he's got to be able to, stand in front of the so-called Russian elites as well as Russian people and show that it was worth it. And therefore, he can't afford to give too much away either. It all kind of points to some sort of, say, like an armistice type, I think has been mentioned as a possible solution. And essentially that would be freezing the territories that are now kind of subject to battles, which is essentially eastern Ukraine, and maybe putting in place some sort of a long-term process to try and figure out what to do with them, and then essentially forgotten about, which is what is the situation today in places like Northern Cyprus and Kashmir. So I think that's the more likely outcome. But it depends on what, how forceful President Trump is going to be in terms of his threats, but also what he offers in terms of incentives, because the Russians are expecting the immediate starting of sanctions easing once they agree to a ceasefire and wants to enter into some sort of a peace process. They will not enter into any process without sanctions concessions being given day one. So, again, a lot will depend on what Trump is willing to do, how badly he wants this peace, how badly he wants to move on from it. But I don't think any prospect of a final deal where everybody's happy is the least likely and probably completely impossible. So frozen conflict, Northern Cyprus type solution is the more likely.
Ivan, do you agree with that? And also, Michael was telling us how very tired people are in Ukraine of the war. What about people in Russia? How do they feel about it?
Well, I would say that Russian economy and people are affected by the conflict on the one hand. However, Russia is simply bigger than Ukraine, and apparently it has more or much more leverage to continue the militarized dispute. I agree that truce is more likely than peace, due to the fact that the major reasons which led to this conflict will not be resolved. So this is not just about Russia and Ukraine. This is a broader problem between Russia and the West, and these problems have not been yet resolved.
Michael, so at the moment we just have this meeting between Trump and Putin scheduled to take place within days. As yet, no news on a trilateral meeting, including President Zelensky. How alarmed will European leaders be at the prospect of Putin and Trump coming to some sort of agreement on Ukraine with no one else in the room?
Yeah, well, I think because a good sign for Kiev and for the whole process is that European leaders were consulted. It was interesting that France nor Italy was involved, but there was a call, including with the NATO Secretary General. So I do think the Trump team realizes that there has to be inclusiveness of European partners. But I think, earlier we were talking about what punitive measures could be placed on Mr. Putin. And speaking of European leaders, there's that 180 to 190 billion euros in frozen Russian assets sitting in European banks. That means a lot to Russia, given the state of the economy. If Mr. Trump were to put pressure on European leaders to say, okay, time to unfreeze it, let's put that at least into a reconstruction fund for Ukraine, I think that would be noticed in Moscow. Other quick things, U.S. could offer to Ukraine those powerful long-range HIMARS and ATACMS weapons, and possibly even a lend-lease agreement where Ukraine could use borrowed funds to buy more weapons from the U.S. But once again, the Russians have to understand that if you don't come to a peace agreement, or at least promise to lay down your arms, it's going to get very, very difficult for you, not only economically, but militarily as well.
Chris, I'm feeling we're going to go over some ground that you've already discussed here, but I'm coming back to that issue of timing. Economically, is there any reason why it's in Moscow's interest to come to some sort of peace deal now, or at least within the next few months? Is timing critical for Moscow to secure what it wants out of any ceasefire deal or end to the war?
I wouldn't use the word critical, but I think it's definitely becoming important. Now, today, the economy is in good shape. There are certainly positive indicators. And even the foreign exchange reserves that Michael mentioned. I mean, Russia's been rebuilding its foreign exchange reserves. They now total 700 billion, and about 300 billion, less than half, is frozen in the West. So they've managed to rebuild a lot of those. But I think the issue is that while the economy is stable today, it's stable on a, shall we say, a fragile base. And one of those kind of fragile points is the budget, it's export receipts, it's the oil receipts. And I do strongly believe that while Moscow was kind of willing to dismiss President Trump's threats, for the last, 5 or so months, I think they're now taking them more seriously, that he could go forward with sanctions. He could he could target oil export receipts, and that would then put the budget under more strain. And then we could see a problem in the economy coming into next spring. So it's more a case of doing something in the next couple of months to avoid a problem into next year. So I think there's a great deal of focus on next spring, partly because I think Moscow fears that Trump's ability to do a deal may start to be compromised from next spring for domestic reasons. But also, if there are more sanctions targeting Russian oil, then the Russian economy will be in a more noticeably less safe place next spring. So I think, the clock is ticking.
Okay. Michael, are we entering a new phase? This is the question we asked at the beginning of today's Inside Story, one that could see an end to the fighting soon. Are you hopeful that the war in Ukraine is now entering its final stages? If so, why?
Yeah, I am hopeful because, as we've been talking about, Russia is feeling the economic pain. They see that Mr. Trump does not shy away from leveling tariffs and sanctions on even his best friends. But there is a big caveat here, and that is China. And, if we're to believe the reporting, the Chinese foreign minister has said that it's not in Beijing's interest for Russia to lose the war. And I think kind of a background reason for that is that China always plays the long game, and they're looking at Russia as an important economic junior partner. And I'll give you a very quick example there is what's available in eastern Ukraine, the parts that Russia holds, are a lot of minerals, but one of them is neon. And guess what? Neon is a very crucial component needed in the production of semiconductors. It's well known China wants to up its game in terms of manufacturing of chips. And I think it's looking at that part of what Russia controls, but also the Russian Far East. So there's this kind of bigger game playing out in the background that could affect things in the medium to longer term.
Ivan, I've got about 35 seconds left. Do you agree with what Michael was saying?
Well, I am a bit more skeptical about the resolution of the conflict. Even if there is a kind of truce, there is a high probability of this conflict to get aggravated again in the future. So this truce, even achieved, may be very fragile.
All right, gentlemen, there we're going to have to end it. Many thanks indeed to you all for being with us. Ivan Timofeev, Michael Bociurkiw and Chris Weafer. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation at X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.
Don't miss out and get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news and expert insights. Like, share, stay ahead.